Let me just start off this morning by saying yes. Yes, I'm not unaware that was not a Christian Christmas carol. I fully know that was not in our hymnal. You're not going to find it in our hymnal at all, and I still ask them to do it. So hopefully Seth and Aaron in the coming weeks will be a little more holy than I am when it comes to choosing their song, and will choose a Christian Christmas carol. But I chose that one very intentionally, and if you'll hold on with me for just a few minutes, I think you'll understand why I chose that song for what I hear. We're doing this series called Do You Hear What I Hear? And its design is for us to go back and to look at popular Christmas songs, Christmas carols, both Christian and secular, and hear them in a different way. Hear them in a way that connects with our stories personally. And so for the next few weeks, that's what we're going to be doing. I'll start out today, and I'll talk to you a little bit about my reflections on that song and on Scripture. And then in the coming weeks, next week, in fact, my wife will be here, and she'll share her reflections on a particular Christmas song. And then in the final week, Seth will come, and he'll share his perspective on a particular song and how that song meets him at where he is personally. And so all of that together will continue to see ways in which God is coming to us as individuals, not just as a community, not just as someone who came years and years ago, but how he comes to us as a community. And so I'll explain exactly what I'm going to get to in just a minute. But I don't know about you, but for me, this particular season is full of complications. Whenever I listen to Christmas songs and I hear different Christmas carols, I'm constantly pulling back to this idea that Christmas is complicated. And it's not because I want it to be that way. Christmas has never been that way for me. In fact, Christmas, the way I actually dream of Christmases, the Christmases that I'm so nostalgic about and want to kind of think back on, those Christmases are seasons that are completely free of all complications. There's no schedules, there's no school, there's no work, there's no worries. It's just family, friends, eggnog, sitting back next to the fire, chilling out. Our stomachs are a little too full. It's the only season out of the year where people like me who are a little too neurotic don't get upset because there's paper all over the floor, unless you're like one of those people who clean up as you go. Like, I don't understand that. Like, if you pull out a trash bag while you're unwrapping presents, there's a problem. You just got to swim in the paper for a while, you know? If I'm neurotic and I can deal with it, so can you. But this is really how deep our delusion is. I mean, think about it. I can get up on Christmas morning, we can unpack gifts and throw them all over the place. There's paper everywhere, and there's glitter everywhere, and I hate glitter. I just hate it. But on Christmas, it is everywhere. And it's okay, because I want it to be uncomplicated. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about the mess, and I don't want to think about cleaning up, and I don't want to think about all the dishes that are in my kitchen that have to be washed because people have been cooking everywhere. I don't want to think about that. I just want it uncomplicated. But the truth is Christmases are a little bit more complicated, aren't they? For many of us, the Christmas season is actually a pretty complicated season. What makes this song that we sang so amazing is that it is uncomplicated. I mean, it is only 55 words in the entire song. It's one verse, it's one chorus. It's repeated over and over again. And for most of us, that simplicity kind of draws us back to a nostalgia that we can rest in because it tells us of a time that was a little bit more uncomplicated. In fact, I think this song is so powerful in this way. It stayed on the number one on the charts in the top 40 every single year between 1942 and 1962 except for 1 year. This is how amazing people thought this song was. There was only 1 year where it didn't rest in the top 40. In fact, to this day, this album right here, 75 years later, is still the best-selling record of all time. That's how much people leaned into this music. They leaned into this reality that they wanted a Christmas that was uncomplicated. And you can imagine why. If you know what was happening in the early 40s in the United States, people longed for a more uncomplicated time, didn't they? When this song came out on Christmas Day, 1941, it was just the beginning of America's involvement in World War II. Just 2.5 weeks later, after this song was released, the bombing would happen at Pearl Harbor. We would get fully involved. Servicemen and women would be separated from their families. I remember my grandfather telling me stories about how he would spend Christmas Day in the middle of the Pearl Harbor, or not in the middle of the Pearl Harbor, in the middle of the Panama Canal on a boat, completely separated from all his family. And it's in this mood, it's in this season where things got super, super complicated that a song like this came and everybody just felt like, oh, that's what we want. a time that's easier, a time that's simpler, a time that's not so complex. That's what I want, a time that's not that complex. But for many of us, the Christmas season is difficult. Christmas season is the one time of year where it's kind of a reminder of broken relationships. It's a reminder of unmet expectations at home or at work or abroad. It's that reminder every year of loved ones that we're missing, who used to be with us but are no longer there. And regardless of your circumstances, Christmas is always that season that reminds us of the light that overcomes the darkness. And this is where the tension rests, because Christmas can exaggerate all the bad in our life, but it inexplicably steers us towards all the good. That's where this happens. At Christmas, all the problems that we can't solve get exaggerated. At Christmas, there's extra emphasis that gets placed on all the relationships that are out of control. At Christmas, it's all the expectations that we can't meet that get overemphasized. But at the same time, while all of this is occurring, this is the season where the greatest news that the world has ever heard lands. The greatest good that man has ever known comes. And I don't think that this tension is new for us in the 21st century. I think there are actually signs of this all throughout our history, and there are even signs of this tension in the first Christmases that were ever celebrated. Christ's coming was a complicated event that landed in a complicated world. And in fact, in one of the earliest occurrences of Christmas, we see how complex that world is. The story that was read to us by Catherine this morning from Matthew's Gospel. Matthew is the only one to tell us this story. Now, Luke also tells us a birth narrative, and he gives us some insight into how Jesus came into the world. But Matthew's the only one who chooses to talk about this part of the story, this difficult part to listen to. And he talks to us about what's commonly called the wise men, right? These are the three wise men that came from the east. We know them. They followed a star. They rode on camels. They had funny-looking hats, or at least our yard ornaments would tell us they had funny-looking hats. I don't really know if they did. I don't know if they wore hats at all. It doesn't make sense to wear a hat. Wear a turban maybe, but not a hat. But they had these weird things. They came over to us from the east, and they were following this star. And what we know is that this particular group of men, as they were coming over, they would see signs in the heavens, and they would try to follow them and see where they led. And this particular sign said that a new king had been born. And so they followed the star until they found this new baby king. And here's what happens. They come, they rest, they leave their gifts, they leave. And in verse 13, we actually pick up where they're leaving. Here's how it reads, and I'll read it to you again just a few verses at a time. When they had gone, the wise men, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. The angel says, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." Now, just imagine this for a minute. The party is barely over, right? I mean, the wise men have just taken off. This may have been Jesus' first, second birthday. We don't actually know. But they've come to celebrate his birth. And they've just left, and the party decorations are still up. There's still confetti on the floor because Mary and Joseph don't care, and they haven't got their pictures loaded to Facebook yet. I mean, like it's super early in this story. Super early in how they're processing this. And as soon as they're sitting down to kind of breathe, Joseph has this dream that says, "Get out of town." And they've got to be super confused about this. This doesn't make any sense. I mean, this is a time of celebration and hope in the future and what all that brings. But now you're telling me to leave town, like something bad is going to happen. Like we just had, imagine for a moment, we had royalty from countries far away come to celebrate this little boy. Like we don't understand it all, but they were so enthused about it. And then all of a sudden in a dream, look, there's another king that wants to kill your little boy. You need to get out of town. Like, this is serious. This is no joke. And so right then, in this moment, everything turns upside down. It doesn't make sense that it landed right now in a season of celebration. It doesn't make sense that it would come to this child, but it does. And Matthew continues on, saying that Joseph got up. He took the child and his mother, and during the night, and they left for Egypt. Now, in verse 15, I won't read it back to us, but we discover that they stayed there for a while. They stayed there for a good while. They kind of set up shop there. They hunkered down for a little while. But it's what happens in the next verses that makes the Christmas story for them so complicated. Verse 16 kind of flashes back to Israel. And here's what it says. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. Now, this is a complicated story. This is a complicated Christmas story. Everything that is happening shifts from normal to weird overnight, where Herod orders all things to be, all infants and toddler boys to be killed. They were starting, Mary and Joseph, you can imagine at this stage of their life, they're starting to sleep through the night. Things are getting normal. Jesus is growing like a weed every single day. Each day he's doing something new, and they've got to put it down in a little book that says what he's doing new. Everything seems normal. He's gotten a normal cycle. Everything's looking good. And then all of a sudden, things get really weird. Problems start appearing that they didn't even know were there. There were relationship issues. They had no idea that they were at odds with this king. There are expectations about who their son was and is and what he should be doing that are causing major conflict, not only for their family, but they're causing major conflict for other families. Other families are experiencing loss. And now, during this season, during one of the first Christmases ever, innocent children are being massacred. Now, this is a strange part to put in the story, isn't it? I mean, think about it. We don't have yard ornaments of this part of the story. That's just not part of what we do. We got the 3 wise men, we got some shepherds, we got a camel and some sheep and stuff, but we don't put this part of the story in our yards. We kind of keep it down. We push it back. And for good reason. I mean, it's terrifying. It's horrifying. But regardless of how complicated this part of the story is, Matthew still tells the story. Matthew thinks it's important to tell it. He says, as raw and horrific as it is, it needs to be shared. It needs to be remembered by the people. And our tendency, when things get complicated, is to do one of 2 things. Either we completely skip over the tragedy, pretend it doesn't exist, it never happened, there's no worry about even looking that direction. Or on the opposite extreme, we try to offer an answer that usually isn't an answer at all. We try to offer the right words at the right time, at the right moment, to the right people, and we end up just kind of messing it all up. And so we err on one of these two extremes. And Matthew reminds us that at Christmas time, at times of celebration, of expectation, of hope, there are victims in Christmas. And we can't overlook that. We can't sugarcoat that. These innocent children died for no other reason than they had the misfortune of being born in the same place and roughly around the same time that Jesus was born. And for Matthew, forgetting them is not an option. It's complex. And it makes the story unbearable in some ways. But even amid the joy of the Christmas event, there are those who are suffering. And their voices need to be heard. And we need to offer their voices in our space and allow them to be heard. And the same is true for us. I know tragedy complicates matters. I know that our natural tendency is to either rid ourselves of the complication by pretending like it never happened, or we try to find some sort of neat phrase that we can offer. But in this season, the last thing you want to do, the last thing I want to do, is focus on the tragedy that this past year or maybe the past years have brought us. It's not something I want to look to. The last thing we want to do is focus on who's not around the dinner table this year. And think about that. The last thing we want to do is remember the fight that caused us to part ways from our loved one. The last thing we want to do is to remember the silence that just sort of settles in around our spouses that ultimately communicates that there's some sort of defeat there. The last thing we want to do is allow those things to rise to the surface. But what we have to remember is this, that ignoring complicated circumstances doesn't mean that we get to avoid complicated consequences. Christmas has a way of exaggerating all of our emotions, good emotions and bad emotions. And in the midst of that exaggeration, avoiding the tension doesn't make it go away. You can't find peace by avoiding life altogether. If we want peace that this season brings, we have to embrace both. Even when embracing both means we still are speechless and we don't know what to say. We don't have the right words to say. We don't have the right words that are coming to us. Our story has to be told. Even if words of comfort can't be found to accompany it, the story still needs to be told. Words of comfort certainly weren't immediately present for the mothers who lost children that day. And that's why Matthew goes on in his story and reminds us of what Jeremiah said. He said as he listened out into the hillside as all of these babies were killed, the only thing that comes to mind is a passage from Jeremiah. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. There are no words of explanation that came to the mothers that day. There were no warrants. There were no court of appeals. There was no stay of execution. There was nothing. There was no announcement of any kind that happened in that moment. It just happened. And those who experienced the tragedy may have never gotten the answer to their question, why? In that moment, they discovered a new complexity to life. They discovered that in that complexity, suffering is not a question that demands an answer. It is a mystery that demands a presence. And that's why Christ came. It's his presence that is changing our suffering. He is God with us, and because he showed up on the scene, we have hope. We don't have hope in what's happening around us. We don't have hope in our current circumstances or the present events of our lives, but we do have hope in what has happened. So do you want to know what I hear when I hear White Christmas? When I hear the song White Christmas, I hear the story of a complicated Christmas. I hear the story of an unexplainable, irrational loss during Christmas. Some of you may know this story already, but the story of White Christmas actually has some sort of reflection back on a terrible happening on Christmas Day, 1928. The song didn't come out until 1941, and some would believe that Irving Berlin, the guy who composed it, wrote it somewhere in the late 30s. But he wrote this song thinking back on Christmases that would occur before 1928. Because in 1928, when he woke up that day to celebrate Christmas with his wife and his newborn son, I.B., who at that time was only 3.5 weeks old, him and his wife found that during the night their child had died. And Irving Berlin woke up that Christmas to find his baby boy passed away. It would be years later before he would actually pin down the words to White Christmas, and he would think about Christmases long, long ago. But it was the happenings of that Christmas that caused him to write of Christmases long, long ago. It was this turning point in his life where he had to go back. And he didn't have to go back to Christmas 1928. He had to go back to what had happened long before that. To Christmases long before what happened when he lost his little boy. In this moment, in that moment, as he's thinking back of Christmases long, long ago, he found his hope. It was what had happened in Christmases that had occurred long before little Junior was born. It was what happened on occasions that brought hope to the happenings of 1928. It was all these things that he could think back on. And in this season, I don't know about you, but I hear a little bit of the same complexity in my own story. For those who don't know my story, on September 17th, 2015, I got some of the greatest news that I would ever receive. I got an email from the adoption agency that we'd been working with for 2 years, and they said, if you want a little boy, there's just been a child born in Atlanta, and he's yours. You're the next person on the waiting list. The mother doesn't want to choose a family. She just wants to go to the next waiting person, and he's yours. And I said, that's amazing. And I paused, and I said, probably should talk with my wife first. So we did that, and my wife was in a meeting, and it was like the longest 2 hours of my life. But we decided by the end of the day that Andrew would be ours. A few hours later, they sent us a picture, and this isn't the first picture that we got of him, but this is his first Christmas. And we had Andrew in our life, and when we saw his picture for the first time, it changed everything. And it's in that moment that the next 12 days started to unfold, and they were the longest 12 days of our lives. We knew that we wouldn't get him until the 29th of September. That was when his mother's rites were completely finished, and we'd be able to go and meet him. And so for the next 12 days or so, our lives were just kind of wrecked. Like, we're waiting. Will she change her mind? Will this happen? You know, can we tell our family? Can we not tell our family? And we waited, and we waited. And then finally the 29th came, and it was like no moment of grace I've ever experienced in my life. 10 a.m. that morning, I arrived at the adoption center where Andrew's birth mother was already there. She had not seen him since she had given birth, but she wanted just a few minutes with him before we came. And Erin and I sat in a room waiting for her to come down the hall, and the next thing I know, I see a door open, and she comes out with this little baby in her hands, and she comes down the hall, and she comes down the hall, and she says, do you want to hold him? Looks right at me. Do you want to hold him? And I said, yes. Like, this is unbelievable, the strength that she has in this moment. And she hands him over to me, and everything changed. Everything in this moment at the end of September, looking towards the holidays, everything started to drastically shift. I spent the rest of the day doing what most of us would do. I called family and friends, and somehow in the mix, which is a really big faux pas for the firstborn son, I forgot to call my mother. And I didn't call my mom until 9 o'clock that night. And as I'm sitting down, Erin is in the other room. We're trying to figure this whole parenting thing out. And she's trying to get him to have, eat a bottle and go to bed. And she's in there. And as I'm sitting in my recliner calling my mom and I talk for about 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. And another phone call comes in. And my mom has a house phone. She's one of the few who still have a house phone, not a cell phone. I'm talking to her on the cell phone. Her house phone rings. And when she gets the call, or when it comes through, she says, "I probably need to get this. I think it's the Asheville Police Department." And she's a chaplain for the police department, so sometimes she gets calls. She gets a call from the Asheville Police Department, and as she's on the phone, I hear a scream like I have never heard in my life, ever. And I can't get through to her. She doesn't come back to the phone. She just keeps screaming and screaming and screaming. And I don't know what's happening. And all I hear, finally, in the midst of that, is my baby. How could this happen to my baby? Just can't believe this happened to my baby. And I suddenly realize that the police are not calling because someone else has passed away that she has to go see, but they're calling because they found my 29-year-old sister passed away. And in that moment, while my new child is in the other room, and this phone call comes through, and the screams that I hear, probably reminiscent of the voices that cry out in Ramah in our passage, everything gets really, really complicated. And on the day that I bring home my firstborn son is the day that I tragically lose my youngest sister, and everything in life is complex. And the only thing that I could ask that day is why? Why is this happening? Why is this taking place? Why is this going on right before Christmas? Like, what is going on? And things would get more complicated in the days to come. But as I pressed into Christmas and I pressed into that season, and as I continued to press into each new season, I realized that tragedy and change that come in our lives come, and we don't always know why it's happening. We don't know where it's happening. But me asking why, it turns out, is probably the wrong question for me to be asking. Because Christmas is not all about what is happening and why it's happening. Christmas, at the end of the day, is about what has happened. Christmas isn't wonderful each and every year because what is happening, but because what has happened. Life itself is ultimately not about what's happening, but about what has happened. You see, what's happening, as I discovered in maybe a new way that year, and I continue to figure it out, and you figure it out each and every year, what's happening is complicated. What's happening is sometimes your children are frustrating. Sometimes they forget to call you with really big news. Sometimes what's happening is that your job is consuming more of your time than you want it to. Sometimes what's happening is that your marriage is failing, and that's hard to deal with. Sometimes what is happening is that your depression and anxiety have reached unmanageable levels and you don't understand it. What's happening is that life is chaotic at times. And it leaves us full of doubt, and it leaves us full of confusion, and it leaves us full of despair. But you'll never get over the complications as long as you focus on what's happening instead of refocusing on what's happened. You see, what's happening can seem chaotic, and in fact, sometimes it is chaotic. But what happened can restore peace. What's happening can destroy all hope in our lives, but what happened will rebuild it. What's happening can destroy relationships, but what happened comes to reconcile all relationships. What's happening can cause us to doubt, and it can lead us to despair, but what's happened can give us faith to believe again that things can get better. What's happening does take life away sometimes, but what happened promises that there's life everlasting. Matthew's message is very clear to us. Even though suffering is happening and more is yet to happen, God's plan and purpose in sending his Son is to bring resurrection life out of death. That's what happened when he came. That's why we gather today. Christmas is not powerful, it's not memorable, it's not a moment that we recognize because of what's happening now. Christmas is powerful because of what's happened. And what happened is this. We find in Christmas the birth of a Savior who saves us from our sins and promises to forgive us for our sins. And in so doing, he will restore all of our relationships. He will restore our relationship with him. He will restore our relationship with one another. He changes everything that's happening right now. And I know this sort of seems simple-minded. In Christmases long, long ago, he became God with us so that we could ultimately be with him. Christmas is the most wonderful time of year because he became God with us to show that he was God for us. And this is what gives me hope for the future. Because of this, when we have a God who is for us, who's working on our behalf, who restores all of our relationships and seeks our good and prosperity, what's happening doesn't matter because what's happened changes everything that will happen. I don't have to worry about what's going to happen in the future. I don't have to worry about this Christmas. Because of what's happened, I already know what my future looks like. I already know what will happen. You don't have to worry about what's happening in your life right now because of what's already happened. You can trust in what will happen in your future. And today we celebrate something that has happened, that has completely transformed all of our happenings today and all of our future happenings. So this Christmas, when we're confronted as maybe no other time of the year, with the fact that there are problems happening that we can't solve, that there are relationships problems happening that we can't control, when there are expectations that are never going to be met, and that gets really complicated. Whenever that happens, remember this, that in the midst of all that is happening, what makes Christmas the most wonderful time of year is not what's happening, but what has happened when God sent his Son into the world. Because when God's Son came into the world, we soon discovered that not only was God with us, he was God for us. And if he is for us, then we can trust and believe that what happened for him will happen for us. And we can have hope. Let's pray.